Hi, this is Mac from Mac's List. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about my new book, Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. I've been helping job seekers find meaningful, well-paying work since 2001, and now I put all my best advice into one easy-to-use guide. My book shows you how to make your resume stand out in a stack of applications, where you can find the hidden jobs that never get posted, and what you need to do to ace your next job interview. Get the first chapter now for free. Visit maxlist.org/anywhere. This is Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm Mac Pritchard, your host and publisher of Mac's List. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Ben Forstag, our managing director, and Jenna Forstrom, our community manager. This week, we're talking about what you should say when a hiring manager asks about the salary you hope to get. Many job applications require you to give a desired salary. How you answer that question matters a lot. Your response can add or subtract thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars to your pay. Our guest expert this week is Jim Hopkinson. He's the founder of the Salary Tutor. Jim says to position yourself to get the highest salary, you probably don't want to give a specific figure. He and I will talk later in the show. Employers may ask other questions about pay when you're applying for a job. A common one is about your salary history. Ben Forstag has found a blog post with advice about what to say next. He'll share it with us in a moment. What do you do if you know you need to learn new technical skills in order to remain competitive in the job market, but you're uncertain which skills employers in your field value most? That's our listener question of the week. It comes from Jeff Croxford in Portland, Oregon. Jenna Forstrom offers her advice in a few minutes. First, as always, let's check in with the Mac's List team. So, Ben, Jenna, our topic this week is one we get a lot of questions about when we're out in the community or at events. And it's about what to say when employers ask about desired salary. How have you two handled this in the past when you've been out there in the job market?
Well, I'll be honest, my ability to answer this question and negotiate salaries in general is probably inversely related to how interested I am in the job. If it's a job, and I've had some jobs that I've frankly taken because I needed to pay the rent or do other things. If I was not that interested, I felt a whole lot more at ease pushing for a higher salary. And I think part of that in my mind was, this is not my dream job, so you're going to have to pay me a little bit more to be here every day. Jobs that I was really excited about, I felt I was nervous about asking for more money because I didn't want to do anything that would derail the process. And I understand that I did this to my own detriment sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a common experience. People either don't have a figure because they're uncertain what the market pays, or, as you say, they don't want to jeopardize the likelihood of getting a job. And I think we'll hear from Jim that while those anxieties are understandable, there are ways that you can remain competitive and even be more competitive and still put a figure out there.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that has been a factor in my career has been if I was able to get deep into a discussion process with someone, you have 2 or 3 interviews. At that point, I felt a whole lot more comfortable having a salary discussion because it was clear that the employer had an interest in me. I think most people, what really scares them is that first interview. When you know there's another dozen candidates that they're talking to, you don't want to price yourself out of consideration really early in the process.
Yeah. Well, how about you, Jenna? When you've been out there and you've gotten that question, and we all get it on applications or in conversations, how have you responded?
I typically go with just like a ballpark figure, probably $5,000 more than whatever I make. I think it depends on if employers or hiring managers or recruiters are asking what your current salary is. And I feel like you need to be honest in that versus what your desired salary is. And usually, I mean, the only times I've ever seen it is like in a form when you're applying online, like through Indeed or Monster.com. But then when you're having a phone conversation with a hiring manager or a recruiter, it's like, okay, there's like a range. You could say like, I'm currently at this, but I think with my skill set, my next role should be around this. And then whether or not that's appropriate is a larger conversation to be had in person.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent response. I'm a big fan of the range too. Whenever possible, though, I first try to deflect the question because to Ben's point, I think we're at a most desirable to an employer when either there's an offer on the table or we're coming back for that second or third interview, and they're obviously very interested in working with us, and that I think is always a good moment to put a number out. And if I do make that leap, I try to have not only a range but something that's informed by research, and being able to cite the research and the source, I think, gives the number even more credibility.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, terrific. Well, let's turn to you, Ben, because every week you're out there poking around the nooks and crannies of the internet, looking for websites, books, and tools our listeners can use in their job search. What have you found for us this week?
So this week I'm actually bringing you two resources. They are both related to this question.
So this is a twofer.
This is a twofer.
Okay.
And I'm not charging you any extra this week.
We happen to be recording this just before the holidays, so it's sort of a holiday gift.
Yes, this is my Christmas gift to you, Mac. You might be the only person out there who appreciates this gift.
Okay.
Yet they won't get it until after Valentine's Day. So really, it's a love present.
That's true, yes. So this week, the resources both have to deal with the question of how to respond to salary history requests. Now, I'll admit, this is a question I've never actually gotten in an interview, but it's a common one where the hiring manager or the recruiter or whoever's talking to you asks you how much you currently make in your job. And I was doing some Googling on this over the week, and there's a lot of upset out there in the interwebs about this question.
Why are people annoyed by this question, Ben?
A lot of people think that it has no bearing on what they should be making into the future, or they're worried that it's going to peg them into a certain pay scale that's lower than they expected, or that it's just an unfair intrusion of the employer into their privacy, that it doesn't really matter. So this week, the first resource I want to share is a blog post called How to Respond to Salary History Requests. And it's from the U.S. News and World Report Careers blog. And this was written by Allison Green, who some of you folks might recognize as the voice behind the Ask a Manager blog post.
Yeah, that's a terrific column she writes. And U.S. News and World Report has a career blog with a number of contributors, including Allison. And I think we've had several of them on the show.
It's a good resource. So Allison is of like mind with you, Mac, because she says it's totally fair for the employers to ask. There's nothing barring them from asking this question. It certainly is a question that has some ulterior motives behind it. The employers are certainly looking to control their payroll costs. But her suggestion, just like yours, is to pivot away from the question, to essentially not answer it. And she offers three good pivots here that I was going to call out. The first one is, quote, I keep that information confidential, but the range I'm looking for now is, and that speaks to Jenna's question of talking about what you're looking for in the future, not what you made in the past. The second one is, quote, my previous employers have always considered that information confidential, but I'm seeking, ... Same idea. And the third one, that's not something I share with anyone but my accountant, but now I'm seeking this much. So again, the idea is, don't answer those questions. And all three of those play on certain biases many employers have, which is don't talk about your salary, the salary you currently make in the organization. And there's a lot of reasons employers do that. But playing into that bias so you don't have to answer their question in an interview might help your hand when you're negotiating your salary in your next job.
This is a great tip. And as you both know, I also run a public relations company. I've worked in political communications for many years in my career. And this technique that Allison is recommending is called bridging. And you acknowledge a question but you change the subject to the topic you want to talk about. And you can see this in quotations and news accounts from elected officials do it all the time. It happens all the time on the Sunday morning public affairs shows too. Somebody will get a question about one topic and then definitely change the subject or the conversation to the one they want to talk about.
Absolutely. And we actually talked about this on a previous podcast, and I think it was all about interviewing, if I recall correctly. And bridging is a useful strategy for just about any interview question. I wouldn't use it for everyone over the course of an interview, but certainly for those one or two questions that you just want to avoid, it's a great strategy. So my second resource this week is a news piece from the New York Times, and I wish I had that breaking news sound, the beep, 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 beep. There you go. And
okay, Ben.
It's a story from the New York Times, and it's an update that Massachusetts is actually the first state that has outlawed the question of what is your current salary or what was your past salary. And the state has outlawed it on the basis that that question entrenches differences in pay between men and women. And so they've made that illegal. So when I said it's a totally legit question that employers are allowed to ask, that's true in 49 states and all territories except Massachusetts. So I'll have links for both of these resources in the show notes.
Well, thank you, Ben. And if you have a suggestion for Ben, please write him, and we may share your idea on the show. Ben's address is easy to remember. It's ben@maxlist.org. Now let's turn to you, our listeners. Jenna Forrestrom, our community manager, is here every week, and she joins us to answer one of your questions. Jenna, what's in the Max List mailbag this week?
This week's question comes from Jeff Croxford, who asks,
Hello, my name is Jeff, and I'm from Portland, and my question is about IT skills. I've been out of the job market for quite a while, holding a position or two, and now I'm finding that there's a lot of new skills out there that I don't have, and I would like to begin to work on achieving some skill currency. But what skills do I learn when there's no particular job target in mind? How do I focus on a particular technology or group of technologies that could be very useful given a particular job, but I don't know what a particular job is yet that I'm looking for?
So thank you so much, Jeff, for calling in. And let me be the first to admit that I am not a tech professional. And I actually was talking to Jeff about this question. And I said, oh, my aunt is a developer. And over Labor Day weekend, she brought this like super big programming book in because she got a new job and had to learn the Ruby language. And she did it in a weekend. So my mind was blown by that. And I know that there's different coding languages and I get that, but like how you can, either my aunt's a genius, which I honestly believe because she's my aunt, but just this idea that there's transferable skills that you can pick up in a weekend. And I think there's two opportunities that Jeff can do in this kind of situation where you don't know what language or what skills or platforms to be practicing, is either a commit to learning one, and maybe you find that information by talking to a local trade organization. So I suggested we have a great partnership here in Oregon with the Technology Association of Oregon. So maybe reaching out, scheduling an informational interview with a staff member there, and just ask like, well, what are the organizations that you work with that your association supports? What are they looking for in developers or programmers or other IT systems? Like what platforms have you been hearing? And then a complete 180 of that would be pick a organization that you really, really want to work at, whether it's Standard Insurance or Nike or Adidas or, I think Salesforce is here in Oregon too. I mean, I know they're in San Francisco, but I think they have a satellite office here. And if there's an organization that has everything you want, like work-life balance, whatever that definition of what your need is, go find out what that organization's doing and study that so that it's all over your resume. But I think overall, when it comes to any job, even if you're not in IT, so this could apply to anyone, hiring managers and recruiters want to see that you're continuing your education and that you're naturally curious while you're unemployed. So you're not just hanging out, watching reruns of Gilmore Girls, but you're learning something and you're trying to stay sharp. That's a a nice skill and a nice quality to have in any employee. So Mac, Ben, do you guys have any other tips?
So first, I really love Jeff's term skill currency. I've actually never heard that before. I really like that. I'm going to start using it. I think you hit the nail on the head, Jenna. Certainly part of it is going out there and focusing on one skill, because you're always going to have some skill deficit, right? No one has skills in everything equally. So specialize in one or two things. And if you are trying to learn a new skill, pick one and like become the master in that rather than the jack of all trades and everything. My suggestion would be look through job postings and see the kind of skills that are listed in the jobs that you find most interesting. And you could probably just do a tally. You know, if you're looking at what kind of programming language I should learn, you know, write them all out on a piece of paper and just do a tally of how many times they get referenced as necessary skills or desired skills in a job listing. And the ones that have the most checks next to them, that would probably be the most in-demand field.
Yeah, I think you're both giving excellent advice here. I particularly like your point, Jenna, about demonstrating a history of learning new skills, because software packages and apps come and go. But curiosity is, if that's a constant in your career and you show that in your LinkedIn profile and in your resume and references and in your interviews, that's going to serve you well. And I like the strategy behind the point you're making, Ben, which is, you know, once you, and Jenna, you made this point as well, figure out where you want to go, what kind of jobs you want to do and are most interested in, and look at the qualifications. And you will see patterns of skills that are required and gaps, and that'll help you zoom in or narrow in on the one or two skills you might pick up while you're doing your search.
Yeah, that's the market-based approach. And I would just throw this one other thought out there, which is it may well be, Jeff, that there's certain program languages that you're more interested in than others. Again, I'm not a techie, so I don't know if it works like that, but I certainly know that there's some new skills that I could acquire that I'd be much more interested in learning about and much more passionate about than others. Not many people are passionate about Excel spreadsheets, things like that.
Pivot tables, what?
That's right. So
I took a class on pivot tables once.
So again, I would say like part of it is if you're just looking for where the market is right now in terms of what the most marketable skills are, looking through job listings and talking to others is the way to go. But also part of this, the answer to this question has to be, what are you personally most interested in as well?
Yeah. Well, excellent advice. Thank you, Jeff, for that question. And thank you, Jenna. If you have a question for Jenna, please email her. Her address is easy to remember too. It's jenna@maxlist.org. Or call her listener line. That number is area code 716-JOB-TALK. That's 716-562-8255. We'll be back in a moment, and when we return, I'll talk with our guest, Jim Hopkinson, about what to say when employers ask you about your desired salary. Most people struggle with job hunting. The reason is simple. Most of us learn the nuts and bolts of looking for work by trial and error. That's why I produce this podcast, to help you master the skills you need to find a great job. It's also why I wrote my new book, Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. For 15 years at Max List, I've helped people in Portland, Oregon find meaningful, well-paying, and rewarding jobs that they love. Now I've put all of my job hunting secrets in one book that can help you no matter where you live. You'll learn how to get clear about your career goals, find hidden jobs that never get posted, and ace your next job interview. For more information and to download the first chapter for free, visit maxlist.org/anywhere. Now let's turn to this week's guest expert, Jim Hopkinson. Jim Hopkinson teaches people how to negotiate salary and get paid what they're worth. He's the author of Salary Tutor, Learn the Salary Negotiation Secrets No One Ever Taught You. And he's the co-author of How to Quit Your Job, a 5-step plan to ditching your day job. Jim joins us today from New York City. Jim, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mac.
Yeah. Well, Jim, our topic this week, as you know, is a common question on job applications. And that's, what's your desired salary? Now, why is this question important to job seekers?
It's really important. It's kind of a loaded question, right? But the way you fill it out is going to be crucial to your job search for two reasons. So number one is that it's going to affect how you're screened for the job, whether you'll even make it to that next level. And number two, even if you do make it to that next step, depending on how you answer it, it's going to set that framework for that negotiation that leads after that.
So we hear from a lot of listeners and readers at Mac's List who have some anxiety about this question. They see it as a kind of a no-win situation for job seekers. Do you agree, Jim?
Absolutely. It's one of the most popular questions that I get asked. It's the most popular post on my blog. And how do we get around this? And people are stressed out because they feel if they don't put the right answer, it's going to affect their job. And it is, but there's definitely a few ways that they can get around it.
And now let's step back for a moment. Why do companies ask this question?
To some degree, they just want to know their range, right? Sometimes it's for good, right? Sometimes there is a job that's out there that they're not sure where, what the range is, or they just kind of use it to screen, and it makes sense, right? They don't want to start interviewing someone for a $50,000 job if the person's used to making 75 or 100K. There's not going to be a fit there. But on the other hand, it is a little bit devious on their part that they can get a candidate to reveal what they're going to, want to make. And if it's a little bit below what they wanted to pay, they can kind of use that during the negotiation and kind of frame it that way.
Well, let's talk about ways people can answer the question, because it sounds like you got to play the game. So you have to give some kind of response, Jim. I know you've got several recommendations. What's the first one that you often suggest people start with?
I would say first is respond with a phrase if you can. So a lot of times it depends if the form is, it could also be a form that is handed to you in the waiting room while you're, waiting for HR and say, hey, fill out this application, but it could be online. Sometimes it lets you put in text. And so you could put something like negotiable or to be discussed during interview, or even things like, entry level or contract or anything that avoids putting in a number.
So I can imagine listeners thinking, oh, gosh, that sounds kind of like I'm dodging the question. Is that going to hurt my prospects and maybe move me right to the reject pile?
I mean, maybe before we get into all this, what the thing to preface it with is that all of this negotiation is going in with the right mindset, right? And I know, people sometimes are in positions where they really need a job or they've been laid off, and I definitely feel for them. But to some degree, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, right? So they have a job for you, and it can sometimes feel like they hold all the keys. But you're going to work for this company and you're going to work hard, dedicate yourself 40 hours a week after week for maybe a year. You want to be interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So you want to go in there with, I have something of value. I want to be able to provide this. And so a lot of times it's just a form that you have to fill out. It doesn't mean you have to fill in every single detail of your life. I've seen ones that go back to back years. It's like, really? You want my paperboy, how much I made, or, how much did you make in college? It's like, I worked at the pizza place in college. Do you really want me to put down $8 an hour? How does that affect the job that I'm going for? That's, a management, marketing manager job paying 40 grand. So to some degree, I say, why are you even asking this? And to some point, they just passed a law in Massachusetts that made it illegal to ask your previous salary. So that could be something that spreads out throughout various industries as we go forward.
Yeah, and in fact, my colleague Ben Forstag mentioned that law earlier in the show when we were sharing resources with listeners. And so that's encouraging, but there's still 49 other states where this is probably happening every day.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so I love the point you're making about mindset, because I think, again, I've certainly been there, and I know many of our listeners are too, where you got to pay your bills and you got to take a paycheck job, and you want to do everything you can to get that gig. But in the long run, we're all going to be in the workforce for decades, and you're right, we do have a lot to offer. So having that mindset is, I think, excellent advice. So you fill out that form, you say negotiable, entry level, or some other phrase. But what if you're online and you got to put in a number? What's your advice there?
I mean, ideally, you can put in, if you're filling out a couple of words, you can somehow make reference to that. So if this is like a note section later, you could say something like, regarding salary, I'm willing to discuss it during the interview. But if they ask you to put in a number, so another option is to use it like kind of a nonsense number, like just put in, 0 or 1 or 999 or $1 million, anything to kind of show that you're not answering it directly. And then again, if you can reference that and say, oh, we can talk about this in the interview. And what's interesting with that is the topic of bracketing. And there's been studies that even if you throw out a very high number that's totally random, like in a negotiation, that anchors future negotiations. So for example, if they're like, say you're talking face to face and they're like, well, how much are you looking to make? And you're saying like, well, I'd love to make $1 million, but whatever's fair in the market would make sense. Just by throwing out that random number of $1 million makes it the negotiation range start a little bit higher. And to prove that, during the test, they said they had students judge the price of something based purely on the last two numbers of their social security number, and those that had higher numbers. Again, a random number, your social security number, would price the value of something higher than someone that had a lower social security number. So it's funny about the psychology behind all of this.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I've read in negotiations, you always want to be the first to put out the number and thereby set the range. And when you do that, you set a floor that affects the rest of the conversation. I got to ask, Jim, I know you work with people one-on-one. You coach people on salary negotiation. What's happened when you've had people you worked with enter a nonsense number?
I mean, that's definitely something that the person has to be comfortable with, right? Better than, because easily what could happen is it could trip up their kind of tracking system, right? So if the computer's looking for 75,000 and you enter $1, there's a chance that you could just be eliminated by, the algorithm there. And you could have a person be like, oh, who's this wise guy? Thinks he's going to make $1 million. So that's probably not the best option. It's just one of, as writing the article, I'm like, that's something you could do, right? But if you can put in a numerical range, that's always better. So, if it's 40 to 50, 40,000 to 55,000 or 60,000 to 70,000, that's one way to do it. And then the last option is if you do have to enter a specific number, and the way you can do that, ideally you do that range. If you have to put a number, then you're kind of boxing yourself in a little bit, but there are ways that you can get around that later on.
So when I certainly used ranges myself, I've seen other people do that. What's your best advice, Jim, about how to set that range? Because you don't want to pluck a number out of the air, and you may be moving from one position to hopefully a job with more responsibility and therefore a higher salary range. How do you figure out what that range should be?
It all begins with the research, right? And I know a lot of people, probably listeners to the show, like, oh, I'll just go on salary.com or PayScale or Glassdoor, and those are great places to start. But I actually break it down into 5 different ways that you can research how much you're worth. And I'm updating my a list of these websites and things like that for 2017. So the first I do is, first go to those salary sites, right? And in addition to those kind of the big 3 there's actually another 5 or 10 other websites that I recommend that people can go to. The second thing is to look at industry salary guides. So for example, there's a company called Robert Half that comes out with salary guides for, let me show you some of the things, for IT professionals, for legal professionals, for accounting and finance, for administrative. There's ones for creative groups. There's one for, educators, things like that. So if you're in IT or if you're in paralegal, you can Google paralegal salary guide and find out specific data around that. The third way is looking for jobs that are out there that have the title listed. So if you go on Monster or some of these sites, a lot of times, I think it's only about 10 or 15%. But if you're looking for, a marketing manager job with 5 years experience in Boston, and you find a marketing manager job with 5 years experience in San Diego, and it looks like almost all of the same requirements, and the one in San Diego has a position and it says it's paying, $55,000, that's one data point that you can use, and maybe you can find 5 or 10 of those. The fourth one is internal networking tips. So talking to people family, friends, coworkers, using LinkedIn or Facebook, and asking them about the salary range. And then the last is external networking tips. So people you don't know. So if you're at a meetup group or on Quora or at a job fair, finding kind of the ranges of salaries around that.
Okay. And I'm guessing that these resources are on your website, and we can include a link to those in the show notes. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yep.
Terrific. Now, we've been talking about applications, both online or in paper, but let's assume you haven't been asked this question about desired salary on an application form, but you get a call from a recruiter. Maybe it's a screening call from a hiring manager, or it comes up in your first interview. Do you do anything differently in a face-to-face meeting or a telephone conversation than you would in responding to a form?
Not really. There is two ways. You mentioned earlier going first and setting that high range. And I think in a lot of cases, that's not a bad strategy especially if you're maybe a little bit older in your career and you know exactly what you want and you have a feeling that you're already making more than they're going to offer. So putting out that high number. However, I think in a lot of cases, it's better to get them to go first. And so in doing that way, you're not going to guess too high. You're not going to guess too low. And so I would use a phrase, something like, there's two ways they can ask you, right? One is, what are you making now? And what kind of salary are you looking for? And in either way, you could say something like, well, I have done a lot of research, and what I found is that it really varies. I've seen positions as low as 40,000 and as high as 75,000 or more. It all depends on the person, the experience, the type of job. So I'm just kind of curious, what kind of range did you have in mind?
So get them to set a range.
Exactly.
Okay. And so what if they say, well, we're not certain. We haven't set that yet. What figure do you have in mind? I'm sure that happens. What's your suggestion?
Yeah, then I would just kind of double down and just say, well, you say you're not sure. I'm sure that's based on a lot of things that we need to discuss. And frankly, I feel the same way. This is the first interview. And right now, salary on a list of things that I'm looking to get out of this job is probably about number 4. So what I'd really love to talk about is, what kind of projects you'd be working on, or what's the design support for this position? Can you talk more about that? And so you're kind of steering it in another direction and just showing that you're there for the job. That money, you're not all about the money. You're there to learn more. And I always say it's coming from a place of honesty. Now, a lot of people come to me and they think, oh, he's the secret salary guy and he's going to teach me tricks how to fool HR into giving them more money. And I say it's not about using tricks. It's always coming from a place of honesty. And so when you're on that first interview and you've talked to HR for 15 minutes and you give the response of, well, I'd really like to learn more about the job first. It's true, right? Like, how do you know if it's a $60,000 job or a $70,000 job? What if you say a low number and then you go through the interview and later on you're like, oh my gosh, like this, I've got to manage 4 people and I'm going to be on the road and I have this budget and I've got to learn all this new stuff. I would need much more in order to take this job. Or what if it's the opposite? What if you put out a really high number and as you go throughout the interview, you find out, oh my gosh, this is my dream job. I get to work on this awesome project and I have 4 weeks vacation and I can work remotely. Alas, you would have taken that job, for anything because it was a great stepping stone. Alas, you gave too high of a number first and now you've kind of overbid yourself. So you have to be careful.
Okay. So listen, keep your doors open, keep your options open, and learn more as you go along before committing to a number.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I know, Jim, some people will ask, well, isn't there a way to avoid this application question in the first place? And how can you get beyond these forms, and what's your best advice there?
That's definitely the main piece of advice. The main takeaway for this is when you're in a position of having to fill out something online, that you're competing with everyone else, right? You're getting boxed in terms of the salary, but if you're finding a job online and you're applying, that probably means 5, 10, 1,000 people might be applying for that same job. And the problem is you're all competing against each other, and it makes it really hard to stand out. The better way is to avoid these forms, completely, is by networking. And there's stats that say, up to 80% of jobs are found through networking. And I've asked it once. I was doing a speech and probably about 50 people in the room. And I said, show of hands, how many people got your last job by competing with 100 other people on monster.com versus networking? And I think every hand but like 2 went up. And it was like, all right, so it's 95% of the people in this room got their job through networking. Why don't they teach, like, every job? Make a joke that when you're in college, and then you go to the career center and they say something like, okay, let's learn how to use monster.com or something like that. And you walk in that day and they're like, welcome to networking 101. And you're like, that's not what I signed up for. It's like, well, if 80 or 90% of the chance of getting a job is through networking, you should at least be spending 4 out of 5 days networking, going to events, talking to people, going to job fairs, talking to people in person versus, trying to compete with everyone online.
Well, I know you're a regular listener, and our other listeners know we're big fans of networking here at MaxList. So it's terrific advice. Well, Jim, thanks for joining us today. Now, tell us what's coming up next for you.
So, big start of the year, and it's a good time to kind of reset. I know a lot of people, after the new year and looking forward, are setting goals, and you kind of fit into a couple of ways, right? You're either you like your job and you're ready to get a raise, and so there's steps to take that, or you're going to get a new job. You're like, you know what, it's time for a change. So I've got articles. I've got a free course on the negotiation mindset, and like I said, that how to quit. If it's time to quit your job, then you can kind of check out that.
Well, terrific. We'll be sure to include links to those resources in the show notes, and I know listeners can find those resources and learn more by visiting your website, which is Salary Tutor. That's www.salarytutor.com. Jim, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Mac.
It's been a pleasure. Take care. All right, we're back in the MaxList studio after my conversation with Jim. Now, Jenna, Ben, what are your thoughts?
I thought he had a pretty good point about deflecting, at least for like initial applications and initial like first round interviews when it comes to salary, and just being really genuine and authentic to wanting to learn more about the role. Because I thought it was really interesting how he said like, oh, you throw out $60,000 and then you find out it's actually a way more intensive role, or it would require more skill sets. And you're like, oh, I just, cut myself off at the feet when I could have asked for $80,000 if you had spent another 20 minutes or another round of interviews to find that out. I thought that was a really interesting point that I never thought about. The flip side is I feel like sometimes when you're typing stuff in and you're applying online, you get like the red box where it tells you like you need to enter a salary. And so I'm curious to see what he would say in that. Like he said, obviously don't put $1 million in because you kind of would come off the wrong way. But what a realistic expectation would be for that moment. But it was a good interview.
Yeah, no, that's a great point about the numbers. And I know we'll include a link to a blog post that Jim wrote about this in the show notes, but he gives 4 or 5 very specific options of ways you can answer that question if you're required to put in numbers, like putting in ranges or, but the key is fill out the box, then look for an opportunity to say elsewhere in the document. Happy to discuss salary as referenced in box 6, wherever the number might have been required during an interview.
Ah, gotcha. That's a good idea.
I liked his point about networking as a strategy to get around this conundrum of having to put a number in a box. And I think networking works not just for the salary piece, but like all the pain points that are associated with filling out one of those online forms. If you can find a way to get around that process and not having to compete as a commodity, or not have to compete on price or your ostensible price when you put a salary there, everything gets easier and less frustrating when you do that. So I really, I think the key takeaway here is if this is the kind of thing that really drives you nuts, like it does drive a lot of people crazy, networking is a good way to avoid having that conversation right up front, or to have that conversation in a much more natural, relaxed way in which both parties already have some sense of the value that's going to be created in the relationship.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for me, the key point I heard Jim make is you got to get around this question, but either by deflecting it or responding to it in a way that allows you to discuss it later. But once you get around it, and if you you continue to pursue the job and remain a candidate, and you can if you answer the question right, as the employer learns more about you, you'll become a more attractive candidate, and the more attractive you are as a candidate, the more open they are to a conversation about salary.
Yeah, and I think that's true of a lot of different parts of the job search piece, where I think sometimes employers and frankly even job seekers immediately go to the places where there's disagreement. And I think strategically there's a lot of value sometimes in saying, let's table this part of the conversation to later so we can talk more about some other things. And then maybe in talking about the value that can be created, things like salary are going to come into clarity for both parties.
Well, terrific. Well, thank you both. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us for today's episode of Find Your Dream Job. If you like what you hear, please sign up for our free weekly newsletter. In every issue, we give you the key points of that week's show. We also include links to all the resources mentioned, and you get a transcript of the full episode. If you subscribe to the newsletter now, we'll send you our job seeker checklist. In one easy-to-use file, we show you all the steps you need to take to find a great job. Get your free newsletter and checklist today. Go to maxlist.org/podcast. And join us next Wednesday when our special guest will be Mark Miller. He'll explain how you can make your LinkedIn profile stand out. Until next time, thanks for letting us help you find your dream job.